Hello.
Our story begins with another nightmare. Jedi Master Obi Wan Kenobi had new iterations of his former pupil to see in his dreams now. For 10 whole years, he relived the horror of Mustafar, whether it be a decade of training his student, 3 years of a war, or 30 hours of shame. Obi-Wan lived it, and was forced to encounter it upon his rest. Kenobi had changed much in the last year. It had been 11 years since the rise of the Galactic Empire, and a full year, starting at midnight, of the defeat of Darth Vader. Obi-Wan only saw Darth as that. Anakin Skywalker was dead, consumed by the identity given to him by his evil master. This hurt him, but it was also something that was easier to come to terms with. The previous 10 years held dreams that made him reconsider his actions, if he had actually killed a savable Anakin Skywalker. As it turned out, he hadn't. There was the same in learning the truth about Anakin's survival, which meant Obi-Wan failed twice by letting him live. Though upon reflection, Obi-Wan could live with the second choice. Kenobi, after learning of Anakin's survival and his transformation, gained understanding of how the Force worked, truly in its most pure form. He, as an individual who hadn't used the Force or a lightsaber in years, was able to masterfully defeat his former pupil again. This, as Kenobi came to realize, was not his will, but that of the Force. By letting Darth survive, he was giving into the trajectory the Force had planned out for the galaxy, one in which light could be brought back to the Force. His Jedi teachings and his understandings now helped him surround himself with the purity of the Force he had rejected since Order 66. Ben Kenobi is who he was now, the bridge between a past life and a future life, a name given to him by a lover, bridged with protecting a boy who held no relation to him, but one he loved with all of his being. Luke would return the Force to balance. Whether he did that through Vader himself or not, Ben did not know, but he trusted the Force. Tonight's nightmare wasn't much different than the ones he had before. Now knowing that his own dear master was with him, Kenobi would often speak to Qui-Gon. While Master Jin was never the clearest communicator, he knew his former instructor was listening, even without responding. This particular nightmare had Obi-Wan wiping sweat from his brow and walking to the other side of the small abode. Luckily, he no longer called a cave his home, so he was able to sleep on an actual bed this time. But he found his chest full of little trinkets and opened it, to which he would find Anakin's old lightsaber. One of the many things that accompanied his most frequent nightmares were what-ifs. Anakin had many opportunities to change things, to not be corrupted, and those had since been vanquished. Time does its thing. The years go by and they never come back. People fade into memories and eventually into nothing. But the lasting effect of Skywalker never truly left his own mind. What was Kenobi to do about that? He couldn't exactly let go of one of his most adored friends, and one of the most traumatic experiences of his life. He meditated on these thoughts, and decided to venture out into the desert for some fresh air. Obi-Wan did need to be careful because of the Tusken Raiders, because they were always ready for a challenger, but they were not out right now. The world and the desert were still. Some of the moons were visible, but aside from the slight moonlight, the planet was a compass in darkness. Kenobi set out into the sands for only a few minutes, but as he did, he became lost. His home wasn't hard to find. It was a very approachable location for him, and he could frequently do what he was doing at this moment. Instead of panicking, he closed his eyes and sunk to the ground. He allowed himself to become a beacon of the Force, and as he did on that moon where he defeated Vader, he became a vessel of it. The Force flowed through him and out around him. It brought him the peace he yearned for, and all of that sorrow he felt inside of his hut abandoned him. Within the next hour or so, he would rise to his feet so that he could return to the homestead, but there was a problem. There was no Tatooine. From the look of things, he was in the middle of space, but he could breathe. So maybe he was on an acid trip? Did Tika give him a bad batch of eggs? Surely not. Obi-Wan felt his head with the back of his hand, and there was no problem, no heat. He looked around himself and remained confused about the situation. Why was he here? Instead of waiting for the answer to find him, he began his own search. During his walk, of which he repeated the same chant quietly to himself, he found more and more answers. Kenobi hadn't been instructed about the world between worlds, but it found him. As he was saying to himself, "I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me," the Force was truly being with him. All of his previous acknowledged acceptances with the Force were being realized in this moment. He understood that the will of the Force itself would trump what he wanted, no matter what. Obi-Wan could not kill Darth Vader, because there was something else destined for him, beyond his own control. And yet, this seemed to be a will of it, that he was here. Just as Kenobi was wandering through this land of portals, he started to fully grasp what he could do, until a grief washed over him once more. He hadn't seen this event play out. He didn't even know that this was the truth. For 11 years, he believed Sidious defeated Master Windu, a Jedi that Kenobi aspired to be like, an individual who was a personal hero and a friend. But here he was, standing triumphantly over Sidious. The Sith Lord, the Empire, billions of lives forever changed in this moment, and then Obi-Wan, who had considered this portal to be incorrect, learned the undeniable truth. Anakin Skywalker, still looking young and vibrant with life, wandered through the door. Mace trusted him, and Obi-Wan could see it. A subtle waving of his hand proved that Anakin was aligned with Mace, in his own mind. Kenobi walked closer to the portal, seeing the apprentice he loved standing there like an angelic being, not tainted by the curse of the dark side. He was conflicted, but not a victim of its plague. Kenobi stood mere inches away from the portal, watching every second commence, as if he didn't already know what was going to happen. But this was his first time seeing the why. He never knew it all started with Windu's defeat at Anakin's hand. That wasn't even conceptually close to what Obi-Wan thought was possible, especially thanks to Yoda's defeat at Sidious's hands. He could not only see, but sense the genuine fear in Palpatine's heart, because he didn't even think that Windu would defeat him, but he did, and now they were here. As the seconds ticked down, Obi-Wan lost sense of his own reality, and started to slowly act on instinct, like he had during his duel with Vader. Every essence of his being, as it was when he awoke, when he walked through the desert, and here in this world between worlds were reactions of the Force. At the moment an empire was born, it was stomped out, when Kenobi pulled Anakin's hips backwards and flung him over his body. Both landed heavily on the portal walkways. And when they both looked up, the portal started to swirl close, and Mace's lightsaber connected with Palpatine. It was the last thing Obi-Wan and Anakin saw, before they turned over to face each other. They shot up. Of course, Anakin was in belief that someone was trying to hurt him, and Obi-Wan reacted the same way he did the last time he saw Anakin in this state. Neither pulled their weapons, but they got into defensive stances. And when Skywalker saw the portal close behind Kenobi, he lost focus and became confused, before asking the question, "Master?" Obi-Wan smiled at him, but worriedly. Anakin was still confused. The last time he saw Obi-Wan, there were hints of gray. This version had more lines across his face. More years of time and potentially stress had worn themselves out across his body. He had aged incredibly well, but it was noticeable because Obi-Wan had to be at least 10 years older. Kenobi, though, nodded his head to the question and asked Anakin if he was okay. It was a weird line of questioning considering everything going on around them, but he nodded, asking Obi-Wan the same question back. They stood apart, and Anakin walked up, putting his hand on his master's shoulder, telling him he looked a little uneasy, and Kenobi just smiled, putting a hand on his apprentice's shoulder and realizing that this was the truth, this was real. He withheld the hug that he wanted so badly, and realized he had made a mistake. He had changed everything, but he also couldn't stop himself from doing it. As if it had been on the moon, the Force willed it into action. Something must have happened that upset the balance in the future of his own timeline. Perhaps Luke failed in defeating his father, or Vader went too far and became unstoppable. Whatever it is, it took the Force a year to realize it needed to end from the inception. The two of them would speak briefly before they were pulled from the world between worlds and dropped on the Tatooine. Yet again, more questions with even less answers. Firstly though, Obi-Wan and Anakin would return to the hut left behind. It confused Obi-Wan because it was exactly how he left it, minus a few items, but he didn't even notice their disappearances. Because of how everything looked, Kenobi assumed that they had returned to the old timeline, and thus committed to telling Anakin about himself, and warning him that they'd have to destroy Darth Vader. He was a villainous Sith Lord. Perhaps it's why he was brought to the world between worlds. This was a truth Obi-Wan had to accept. Anakin was a little bit of a basket case because this was terrible, but he at least had time to consider what his actions would have done. Instead of being rewarded for attacking Mace, he learned the truth about himself, becoming Vader. The attack on the temple was glossed over, mostly for Obi-Wan's sake, but Mustafar, Mapuzo, Yabim, and the Moon were spoken about the most. This was all very jarring, but it led Anakin to coming to a question, one that he didn't think about immediately due to the situation, and Obi-Wan's facial changes. What about his child? And Kenobi had to walk through that as well. These conversations lasted through the night and into the early morning, where the two would decide to head to the local town to get some food at a cantina, because Kenobi was out of food in the hut. Not that he frequently expected guests. However, upon their trip to town, they stopped. Above the closest spaceport town, Mos Eisley, they found something mildly concerning. A Venator-class Star Destroyer was hovering over the city. Though what confused them the most was this was still holding Republic decals. The red stripe crossed its hull, with some other paint modifications made to the bottom of the ship. The markings weren't familiar, but from their viewpoint, it looked as if it read Outer Rim Division. Skywalker was confused because, judging by the stories Obi-Wan told him, this shouldn't be the reality. Well, for Kenobi, it was equally as confusing. Anakin suggested that they begin their trek towards the town to investigate, and Obi-Wan followed, with a bit more hesitation than before. The great pit of scum and villainy in the galaxy had shifted drastically since Obi-Wan was last shopping in this town. A major change was that of the local enforcement. The huts typically had grunts and soldiers wandering around, keeping the order, but there was none of that. A Republic recruitment office was stationed at the front of the town, with a second one in the middle of the largest speederway in town. Anakin asked if this was the Empire Obi-Wan referred to, and he shook his head. As they continued walking through the town, someone yelled out at them. It was the voice of a clone, and Anakin turned back first, seeing someone from his own division, and he smiled. He asked Jesse what he was doing out here. This confused the now clone commander. In all fairness, the last time Skywalker saw him, he was just an ARC trooper. But as Anakin greeted his former trooper, he and a few dozen other clones, following information with him, raised their weapons and demanded that the Jedi surrender. Obi-Wan and Anakin got side by side but did not ignite their sabers, as Skywalker asked why they were being targeted, and Jesse read out the command under the illegal Jedi Act of 19 BBY. As stated, any Jedi found in Republic Coalition territory should be issued a formal arrest, given a 24-hour sentence, and be removed from Republic grounds. If this Jedi was a second-time offender, their sentence would be increased to a week, and if they were a third-time offender, then they'd be executed. These were much better terms than Order 66, so the Jedi took this option and went straight into custody, where they would learn more about this new world. Jesse knew General Skywalker hadn't been seen since the day everything changed, but he still wasn't going to give General Skywalker an easy time because they served in the same unit. However, the clone commander would tell the two Jedi everything they missed, even though they should realistically know everything. It started the night General Windu killed the Supreme Chancellor. Palpatine was executed in cold blood, and through a rigorous court defense with a number of senators, the Jedi would be expelled from Coruscant and the Republic. They called it a triumphant day. Jesse admitted that he and Commander Tano were returning from Mandalore with Maul when this all started. Luckily, the Jedi dealt with the Maul situation, humanely as Ahsoka called it. She had hoped to rejoin the Order, but no one knew where Skywalker went, so they tried to encourage her to join. She instead went off with a senator from Naboo. Jesse then ran through the next several years in broad strokes. The war with the Confederacy didn't end after the Jedi exile. Instead, it picked up from the Outer Rim sieges, and dragged on for another 2 grueling years. The clones had become resentful of the Jedi because they weren't on the front lines, but Jesse even suggested that perhaps the army should have been more critical of the Republic instead. He admitted that the formal request for 5 million new troopers was Palpatine's lasting legacy. Without that, they probably would have lost the war. But thanks to a brave squad of commandos from the Bad Batch, they were able to shut down large quadrants of the droid army. It's why it took years to finish, but a victory is a victory. There were some conflicts with the Jedi who attempted to earn Republic favorability, but they were seen out of the Republic. it would be under the orders of Chancellor Sly Moore that the Jedi would be barred from entering Republic territory. These rules were changed with the following Chancellor, who made them even more restrictive, just adding to the original bill. Thanks to movements inside the delegation of 2000, clones were given public rights, and the Senate, with greed in their eyes, declared an official Republic coalition crusade to conquer the Outer Rim, and that's what they did. The neutral systems and Confederacy were brought back into the scene as Republic allies, and the actual government extended into a coalition, hence the name change. Jesse stretched and then sighed, telling them that things were nice for a little while. Many clones left the army and tried to start lives, but it didn't really get most of them anywhere. The Republic fleet just waited for operation, and then, 3 or 4 years after the Battle of Coruscant, another conflict started. The Pike Syndicate apparently got a hold of former Separatist resources, and outfitted themselves with an entire army and navy. The clones were called back into action, and Jesse admitted shamefully that many clones rejoined because despite having pensions and clone districts, Republic rights, and protections, they didn't have an easy time living in Republic society. It was a shame too, but that was the reality of the situation. Jesse told them that many clones were fighting back against the Syndicates. A lot of the Outer Rim belonged to the Republic, but there were pockets of impossibly large resistance. He didn't know how they couldn't have heard of this, but according to reports, Anakin fell off the face of the galaxy. No one had seen or heard from him in almost 11 years, actually closer to 12. Jesse explained that he considered making a report, but either they were gaslighting him or they sincerely didn't know. So he would let it off. Anakin and Obi Wan were good Jedi, but he did suggest that they get away from Republic Coalition territory. This was their first warning. There were a couple of other unimportant details that he gave them, but there were some answers he did not know. He did not know where Senator Amidala or Ahsoka went. He did not know about the whereabouts of the Jedi Order, and he did not know that alongside the rise of the Pike Syndicate, there was something else, something more sinister than a band of pirates finding the Separatist Reserve Fleet. Out in the wilderness, on a moon located a short lightspeed skip away from the Jedi Temple, something sinister found a group of Jedi Scouts. Something vile, something transformed by his vile master. A master who was not a true Sith Lord, an individual who served as a temple guard, someone promised a place inside the Empire that never came to life. Violam, the would-be Grand Inquisitor, the temple guard that once thought the Sith were eternal, was the last of their broken religion. He had seen the galaxy transform, and his apprentice, covered in a dark mask, hunted Jedi in this barren land. What the Jedi were looking for, master and apprentice did not know, but the Sith, or the new Sith Order, were searching for the Jedi so that they could be destroyed. It was true what Jesse said. No one had seen or heard from the Jedi since their fall. Now it was the apprentice's chance to make worth of himself. The squad of 8 Jedi continued wandering around, looking for what they called a vibration in the Force. The High Council felt the opening of the world between worlds, hence why they sent these Jedi onto this moon. They believed that they'd find something to aid their cause. Instead, 8 Jedi would be ambushed by a crimson-wielding monster. The apprentice slid his weapon around his body and skewered people on it. He decapitated members, he mercilessly killed them, and he showed not a hint of mercy with any of these kills. He even ruthlessly snapped the neck of the last Jedi with his bare hands. The Order was far from his discovery, but the Council, upon finding the scout team in the following 48 hours, would be reminded of an era they thought they left behind. The Sith, after being destroyed a millennium before, survived, returned, died, and somehow managed to come back from the dead again. How the Jedi planned on fighting it had yet to be determined. Obi-Wan and Anakin had one task to fulfill first, which was finding Padme, Ahsoka, and the twins. They were alive somewhere, and even though Jesse was too kind or kinder than he should have been for this current era, they utilized the kindness and searched the star maps which they had received from their clone ally. There were too many planets to choose from, but they started their search for the former Senator and former Jedi Padawan. Obi-Wan and Anakin were able to recapture what had been lost in Kenobi's timeline. He had to pinch himself because he never thought he'd ever see Anakin smiling again. It pained Skywalker to know how he had hurt his master so badly in the past, but he was glad they could try and make things right in this timeline. Thanks in part to the situation, which was a standoffish Cold War with the Pike Syndicate, The two Jedi were able to avoid criminal territory and Coalition systems all the same. The biggest fear is that Padme would choose a Republic planet, but she wasn't listed as a resident in the senatorial district on Coruscant, and after getting into contact with her parents, they confirmed that she didn't reside on Naboo. This doesn't mean that they didn't have contact with her, but she lived on a world outside of Republic territory to hopefully find Anakin again. Padme was slightly paranoid about Republic interests after the war was supposed to end. When the Senate turned on the Jedi, and Master Windu informed her of Anakin's disappearance before his very eyes, she didn't know what to do. Ahsoka and she had reconnected, and when the Jedi were exiled from Coruscant, they went their own separate way. In fear of the Republic sending troopers after Anakin, if they knew where he was, Padme decided to keep her location secret, but Ahsoka and Padme frequently visited the Nibiris on Naboo. Luckily for the two Jedi, there were only a few select planets that the two of them could have gone to. It was up north, and from those planets, Anakin and Obi Wan selected Shilly, the Togruta homeworld. On the way to the system, Kenobi read up on why they weren't a part of the Coalition. Because so many of their people had been actively prideful Jedi in the past, the Togruta people chose to abandon the Coalition due to policy changes. The Republic gripped them harder, and it turned into a planetary revolution. Galaxy-wide, it was referred to as the Peaceful Resolution because there were some notable protests but no show of force, and then they just stopped paying their taxes. Due to the start of the conflict with the Pikes syndicates, the Republic gave up on trying to enforce their rule. Inside the main chambers of Obadiah, the apprentice knelt before his master. Violam turned and smiled, welcoming his student back. The Sith rose and released a knapsack on the table in front of the Pike leaders. These were businessmen, warriors, captains, and so forth. They all watched in awe as 8 lightsabers sprawled out across the table. The apprentice stepped away and quietly nodded their head. The duo of Sith in the new era was not a typical master and apprentice deal. Violam wasn't just a weaker and younger Paul Sith Lord, he was a controller who masterfully articulated. The apprentice was the only name the Keldor Sith went by. No one knew his full name. He did know he was more powerful than his master, but they had non-verbally agreed to these terms. The apprentice was covering his tracks by learning from Violam. In all fairness, when this dynamic started, Violam was the strongest of the two. He was a temple guard turned last Sith. His instruction of the former Barrando sage, he corrupted, helped him see the true path. Years of lightsaber work turned the apprentice into a fierce combatant. Grand Inquisitor knew the time for his own demise would come soon, but the apprentice had no intentions. The rule of two could be larger than a generational game of pass the torch. The problem with two Sith descending from a lineage of no Sith is that their morals and understandings weren't what allowed the rule of two to persist. They existed in spite of a lot of Darth Bane's ideologies, because they never spent the time trying to understand them. Their work had been with the criminal syndicate they were currently interacting with. The Pikes were grateful for the assistance, in all honesty. Grand Inquisitor had given some extra legs to take down Crimson Dawn before it could get off the ground. Thanks to the Separatist Navy, they were a true threat. The Coalition was bearing down on them, but they weren't out of the fight yet. The proposed next move was a counter at the Republic headquarters of the Outer Rim. It would involve the two Sith as leaders and motivators in the operation. On Shilly, the Republic shuttle landed, and the Togruta were unsure why it was here. They then saw Obi-Wan and Anakin, two people more than recognizable. As they had agreed, they split up and searched. It would ironically be Obi-Wan who found Padme and Ahsoka first. They had both grown up, not quite as much as he had, but enough. He was so happy to see them, and the first thing they did was look at his old, but I guess better put, mature face. Ahsoka teased him for his wrinkles, and he laughed a heavy old man laugh, before telling them both that Anakin would be so happy to see them. A glimmer of hope shot into Padme's eyes. She didn't just get one of her best friends back, but also her husband. When they reunited, it was surreal. After everything Anakin had learned, it felt like a lifetime had passed. And for Padme, a lifetime truly had blown by. They didn't reunite with a big hug. They didn't reunite with words. It was just a moment in time, one where their hands touched, and they just stared at each other. Padme's entire world had been lost, and she assumed he was gone forever, but he was back. She spent 11 years looking at the twins that reminded her of him every day, and now he was real. There were a few tears, before they embraced each other and they never let go. They couldn't. The weight of loss and suffering that Padme had experienced, and Anakin could only imagine, broke apart in this hug. They were inseparable, free from despair of losing each other and home at once. Home was wherever the other was, and no longer was it a divided house. Anakin's little sister would of course get a big, huge hug too. But what defined this moment, and really everything for Skywalker, was meeting two people he could only imagine. Obi-Wan had done a fine job telling him about the twins, but seeing them was surreal. It was a little stiff, a little awkward. The twins had grown up hearing stories about their father. They had seen pictures of him and knew that he was a good man, because that's who Anakin was. Skywalker was not Darth Vader. He did not betray the Jedi, or his wife, or his apprentice, or himself. He was wholly the man everyone knew him to be. Luke and Leia were just awestruck. Those were the names Padme and Anakin selected if there were to be a boy or a girl. Well, they had twins, and she couldn't help but give them those names. Leia and Luke Nabiri Skywalker. Anakin got down on his knees to be eye level with them, and he told them that he had found his way home. During the trip through hyperspace, and hoped that the twins would still be born in this timeline, he created 2 Japor snippets for the twins. He snagged some Japor ivory wood from the clone outpost on Tatooine, and used the lining on his Jedi robes to turn them into warm and comfortable necklaces. The family that should have always been was finally together. The 4 Skywalkers, Ahsoka, and Obi-Wan, finally all in their own happy ending. Obi-Wan himself could have waited a lifetime to experience the euphoria of this moment. In many ways, it felt like he had already lived a lifetime, but right here and right now, he was arguably the happiest man on Shilly. The next couple of weeks would see Skywalker's embrace of this new way of life. Anakin had the chance to meet and know his kids, and honestly, they hadn't changed much since Obi-Wan knew them in another life. A little different, but they were not plagued by the obscurities of their previous situation. They had a loving mother and a loving aunt. However, this is Star Wars, and things can only be wholesome for so long. Republic High Command at Eridu was struck by the Pikes Syndicate. It was a lethal blow that had a reported 49,000 clones killed, and another 170,000 civilians and or Republic military personnel. It was a strike that crippled the space station and fleet, and there was a warning of Dark Jedi, as the report called it. No one had seen the Jedi in half a decade, and this was the first time they were seen at all. Anakin and Obi-Wan watched from the local news while they were cooking dinner. Kenobi had Luke on his shoulders with a chef's hat on, essentially playing Ratatouille, while Anakin was gentle parenting, by using the Force to assist Leia with her cooking work of art, which in fact was not really gentle parenting. They played things cool until dinner and dessert were eaten and the kids went to bed. Ahsoka didn't want them to go, because it wasn't their position. She believed it was the fight of the Republic or the old Jedi Order, wherever they might be. But Kenobi, obligated by what he had experienced in the previous timeline, suggested differently. Skywalker stood by his side. They couldn't let these animals destroy the Republic. They didn't even have to agree with the Coalition or what they did to the Jedi, but these were still innocent people who did not deserve to die. Padme hated to agree, but they were right, and there was no stopping Anakin if he believed in something. So Ahsoka suggested that they all go on one final mission, one to stop this criminal regime. The most efficient route would be through Obadiah, and that's what they'd agreed to do. Thanks to Ahsoka's contacts on Shilly, they were able to borrow a cargo cruiser that had no issue slipping through the defense line. It just meant that Anakin would have to be saying goodbye to a family he wanted to spend every moment of eternity with. In hyperspace, the 3 Jedi, now all much older, except Anakin, ironically, discussed their strategy. Since Obi-Wan and Anakin fought Dooku on Obadiah, well, technically recently, they believed they'd have some updated specs. But Ahsoka, on her previous vacation with Padme to Naboo, did some digging. It turned out the Syndicate had production facilities that dug into Republic territory. Cutting the head off the snake wouldn't be satisfactory enough. Ahsoka confessed that she hoped the Jedi would return from the dead to fix this problem. When she wished for Jedi, she kinda hoped it wouldn't be Anakin and Obi-Wan, because this was something the Old Order needed to do. But she digressed. Chances are, since they'll be landing in the supply depot, their best option is to use the production facilities to get into the base. Anakin and Obi-Wan agreed to follow her directive. Upon landing on the Pike homeworld, they would get a good view of the Syndicate fleet overseeing a majority of the operation here. It was a massive separatist battle fleet, outfitted with Lucrehulks and bulwarks and much more. The insane thing about the Pike Syndicate was the fact that had Palpatine survived, these resources would have been destroyed. But with Palpatine killed, and the war continuing, it took up until it was too late for the CAS Council to activate the reserve military for them to activate it, because the Pikes found it by that point. The 3 former Jedi squeezed past security and used the production lines into the main facility. Not everything was produced on Obadiah, some of it was just being scanned before getting shipped out. So much of this was miscellaneous products, but Violum believed in long-term planning. They had a bunch of front companies that would sell pencils and toys and shirts and whatever else, and once trust was established, they could start sending their actual product. For example, spice. It was all an elongated plan, and the Sith were preparing to start the next leg of their operation. Inside the base, the apprentice sensed the Jedi before Violum did. Grand Inquisitor informed his student that he would confront the presence. He was to stay here and alert the leadership if there was a problem. In other words, if Grand Inquisitor died. Ahsoka got to the end of the production line, and the 2 others ignited their sabers and opened up a door, leading them into the main structure. Their goal was to find a bundle of explosive materials so they could sink the entire base. As they turned the corner, they faced off against a crimson-wielding Paul-Un. He stood there, not expecting to see these 3 Jedi. It was a sick trick. His apprentice made the other 8 sound easy, and that's because they were. These 3, though, had the power of plot armor throughout the Clone Wars. Again, from Violum's perspective, Obi-Wan got shot in the chest and survived. So he had enough of that, and swung forward, unprompted, trying to end their plot armor. Kenobi took a step forward and blocked the strike, as he told the other 2 to keep going, make sure their troops were not alerted. It had been years, but Obi-Wan recognized this Jedi, a former classmate, someone who quote-unquote went on a spiritual journey, which just meant they became a temple guard. The sound of sabers clashing away behind them was soon eclipsed when turbo lasers started shaking entire corridors. It turns out these 3 had some special timing. The Syndicate awoke a sleeping giant. A core-bred fleet from Kuat, which housed 5 Star Destroyers, arrived. These monstrous vessels faded from the spotlight without Palpatine's backed Tarkin naval program. But right now, because war was profitable, the Republic avoided ending the conflict. Now that they lost almost 200,000 people, they were going to make the Syndicate pay. The Republic coalition was here for heads, and it made things a lot more complicated. Clone star pilots sped above the base and fired torpedoes into the defense turrets. Obi-Wan and Violum continued to trade blows as the building rippled with explosive waves. Kenobi spun away from the Sith Lord and pulled him past his body. Grand Inquisitor threw his staff backwards, stopping Obi-Wan. The Jedi Master aggressively whipped into Form 4 and lunged into the Temple Guard's defensive line. Violum avoided a strike as he swung into Obi-Wan's defense. Obi-Wan pulled his opponent towards him and slung his saber right into his chest, killing him instantly. Obi-Wan had also watched the Kenobi show and remembered that Paul-Uns have 2 stomachs. He tossed Violum's body over to the side, and as his body fell, his eyes landed on something interesting. Good old Rhydonium. He pulled up a sleeve over his face and moved in to investigate the site. Anakin and Ahsoka came across a Kel door in the hallway. He asked them if they were alone. He got separated from his squad. They were confused, and he admitted that the clones and Jedi were getting together for one final stand against the Pikes. Eridu had been a step too far, and they were going to end things. Ahsoka and Anakin warily stepped back, not trusting the apprentice who questioned their motives. As he was speaking to them, a dozen or so Pike troopers rushed down a corridor behind them. The apprentice activated a blue lightsaber and jabbed at Ahsoka. Anakin swung his hands outwards with all of his strength, and he accidentally tossed Ahsoka to the side, but not too far. The Kel door, on the other hand, tumbled across the ground and was clobbered by debris. Anakin ignited his saber and defended his apprentice, as she readied her own blue blades, still not having changed them to remember her master. He made a snide remark about the color, and she could only roll her eyes. As they were fending off the Pike members, the Kel door got up and approached from behind. He had hoped to catch the Jedi off guard because he was a Kel door after all, and he was using a dead Jedi's weapon. He was quiet in his pursuit, but by the time he reached the Jedi, the soldiers had all been killed, and they turned back and defended themselves. Obi-Wan, with fire raining down from the skies and a massive battle taking place over the planet, rushed Rhydonium canisters into hovercraft. which was very painful and heavy. He could hear the sabers clashing, and he knew that his friends had found the other Sith. Anakin ducked a strike as Ahsoka, still remembering their fighting patterns from the Clone War and their strategies, countered the Sith. He defended the strikes, swinging aggressively and moving across the halls to avoid getting killed. As he deflected a strike, he fired red electricity at the others. This wasn't something he had ever showed his master, just a trick he used to kill those who opposed him. The apprentice was blocked by the other apprentice, Ahsoka, who crossed her sabers into an X and flung the electricity back into his face. His mask was blown off of his face, and the pure power of the dark side eviscerated his body. Anakin grinned at her, and told Ahsoka she did well. She nodded, and rushed with him to check on Kenobi. He pointed them towards the Rioto stash, and they were amazed but also concerned, because since when was Obi-Wan a pyromaniac? He stared at them for a moment, then smiled, telling them to hurry. They needed to get out of here before the Republic finished off this base. The next few minutes would be crucial. See, the part of the facility they were in was like a bunker. Sure, it rattled, but it was designed to survive an explosion from the outside. However, if the bombs were inside, there was a problem. The three did everything they needed and set the charges before taking their cargo ship and abandoning the planet. As they were preparing to leave, though, a Venator moved to intercept them, and they very quickly called over, telling them that they had just laid a bomb inside the facility. You'd never believe it, but a gray-haired Admiral Yularen certainly couldn't. He escaped this trio of destruction for a decade, and somehow he found them again. He paused and asked them what they had done, and Ahsoka cockily pressed the trigger button in front of him, as the facility ruptured, sending a shockwave across the surface of the planet and detonating the facility. She saluted to Yularen before cutting the comms, and they departed into hyperspace, avoiding the rest of the ensuing battle. When they returned home, they were given a hero's welcome, because while they were in hyperspace, a grizzled and old Marshal Commander Rex and Admiral Yularen described the actions of Ahsoka Tano, Anakin Skywalker, and Obi Wan Kenobi as heroic at Obadiah. How they got there or why they were there was not mentioned, but their valor, honor, courage, and what they were able to do were commendable. It was the first step to try and welcome the Jedi Order back into the galaxy, but that order would never budge from their secrecy. Obi-Wan would never see his old friends, or this version's timeline of himself. He would, though, remain on Shili with his family. The Pike War would be a rout from that point forward. The entire Pike Council was killed off in the bombing that Ahsoka cockily set off, and Padme during all of this time would be able to find Rex and get him to Shili, where he'd be overjoyed to see his friends again. When he eventually retired from the military, this would become his home. The politics of the coalition continued to twist and turn, with it evolving into an almost galactic-wide government. Few systems like Shili would remain neutral, but they would also be free from piracy, so they got the best of both worlds. The Sith were destroyed for good, due to Violam and his apprentice's lackluster approach to their way of life, and the Jedi were just a forever secret from the Clone War era. Ahsoka and Obi-Wan would find their own ways to live in this era. Ahsoka had been seeing someone on Shili for some time, but the knot wouldn't be tied for another couple years. Kenobi would partake in a shipping job, and he would help the Shili in their trade work. That's also how he'd find his own partner. It was a big galaxy, but for this family, it was a small one because they remained on Shili permanently. It was a peaceful world, one without the politics of the coalition, one free from the wars in the stars, one not tied to traumatic suffering, and one where all three former Jedi could live, grow, and thrive in happiness with each other in one big, happy family. And that, my friends, is a pretty wholesome PP story, and special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So, pretty wholesome, pretty PP is everywhere, you know? Speaking of PP everywhere, go check out the VOD channel. I have a PP live channel. I put all my VODs up there. It's pretty outrageous. Here's a clip. No. I fucking rolled! I'm rolling to Poland! Oh, he's coming! He's coming everywhere! No, not like that. Yeah? Yeah, that's something. Anyways, this story, let's talk about this. So, having Kenobi-era Obi-Wan save Anakin is something I don't think's ever been done before, and I think it opens up a ton of potential opportunities. I'm in firm belief that Obi-Wan was acting as Will of the Force, in that show, which is why he doesn't kill Vader. It's kind of why he's very ominous when he tells Maul that Luke is the chosen one. I think that's just Obi-Wan being Ben Kenobi, not Obi-Wan. And so I wanted to kind of tackle Ben Kenobi in a year following that event. I think he'd be a lot more meditative, a lot more reserved, and you kind of see him come back to life. You kind of like see this transformation. Obviously, you get the whole happy ending with Anakin, Ahsoka, and Rex and all them, but more than anything, this is a transformation from Obi-Wan, or from Ben Kenobi back into Obi-Wan. And I think that's kind of really kind of poetic and beautiful, because he loses everyone, and he doesn't get to be with his friends, the Jedi, anymore, but at least they're alive. At least they're not suffering. At least they are not fearful. They're alive somewhere, living their best lives. And then he's with people that he absolutely adores. But honestly, this might be one of the most wholesome stories I've done, if not done in a while. But I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love. And always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you. Huh? No. No. Ah! Oh! No! 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 Not like this! Not like this! Hi! Hello!